Well, hello. In this little video unit, we're going to learn about a few key concepts surrounding something called the Middle Passage. So as we're looking at our map, can you identify what we're looking at? That's right, it's the world. So, looking at the origins or how America came to be, we got to start, of course, with England. Now, that is England right there. There it is. And of course, the English migrate to America right here where we are. That's where the colonies are, crossing the Atlantic Ocean. Now, the Middle Passage deals with the slave trade, which, of course, came from Africa. For this unit, there are two questions we want to consider. The first is, why was slavery introduced to the colonies? It's a good question when you think about that there really wasn't any slavery used in Europe, especially in England. So why did it become a big thing in the New World? And our second question is, how did the institution of slavery influence European and African life in the colonies? Good question. There's that. When we talk about slavery, we tend to think of these big old homes like this. These are what we call plantations. And how did we get to a point where we had slave labor working on plantations? Well, this type of lifestyle came along much, much later. The first slaves were really brought over in, let's see if I can write this, 1619 to Jamestown. And the plantations are around much later in the 1800s. And there's a few before that, but we'll take a look at that later. Now, as I mentioned, this all starts, let's see, in England. I can't get my pen to work. So England, which is right there, and the slave trade, and go down here to the west coast of Africa. Now, in Africa, there had been literally for hundreds of years, in fact, it's still there, a slave trade. So right where you see the yellow, there was already established slave traders working out of this area, and so the Europeans could sail down here, they would sell their goods, they would pick up enslaved Africans, they would use, there it is, the Middle Passage, to bring the slaves back to here. And this is the New World, usually stopping in the Caribbean, sometimes coming straight to North America. And where the colonies were is right along this area here. That's where the English colonies were, with Jamestown being somewhere about right there. This again is called the Middle Passage. Now, looking at conditions on the slave ships, it was not good. The basic thing that slavers argued over was quantity over quality. So on a ship, unfortunately, quantity won out typically. What you see here is a diagram of a ship layout, and these are the different decks. And these are people. And you can see they're actually shoulder to shoulder, and they fill up the entire interior of the ship. The idea of quantity over quality is that you could bring a few slaves in one ship, and pretty much all of them would survive, or you could bring lots and lots of slaves in one ship, and even though a lot of them would die, you'd still end up with more slaves than just the quality system would allow. So to give you an idea of what we're talking about, this is an artist rendition of what living conditions were like in slave ships. You weren't given bathroom breaks. The people were actually chained. The slaves were actually chained up where they were. So You can't imagine how filthy it must have been. Also inside these ships it would get to be over 110 degrees. Of course you would not only get sick from the smell and all that, but from seasickness. So these places, the smell, the heat, everything contributed to why a lot of people died on these journeys. The way that the slavers tried to combat this was about, for an hour a day, they would bring groups of slaves up onto the deck and let them sit or walk around for an hour, and then they'd put them back. So this is what the slave trade looked like inside one of the ships. Now, what was it that the Europeans were looking for? Well, they were looking for cheap land. And that's exactly what they found. I mean, they got here to North America. There was nobody here, right? I mean, it was just empty. Well, there were hundreds of thousands of Indians, but there was nobody here who had a deed or a mortgage. So, the European way of thinking, land was up for grabs. And it was so cheap by comparison that really the poorest person from Europe, once they made it to the New World, usually could get their own farm. And how they got here was as indentured servants. And at first they brought these servants from England, which is right there, Scotland, right there, right there, and Ireland. But as I said, as they brought these guys over, they would, sometimes the servants would run away and just build their own farms, start their own farms, or they would wait till their indentured period was over, and then they would go find their own farm. So the result was there was never enough people to work the farms. So what do? We got all this land, and I've paid off my debt. Now what? We need labor. We need a permanent, replaceable labor. And that's where the Europeans decided to go with slaves. And this takes us back to the Middle Passage. What they discover is that the the agriculture was extremely profitable in the best places to farm, which is to say the South. So down here, you might recognize some of these states. There's yours right there. There's Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia. Turned into what we would call an agricultural slave society. This word agricultural, you should know, is a fancy word for farming. And this really kept up from 1619 right up until the Civil War in 1861. You can see on this map the divisions that started to form between these areas. And right there, of course, this division in 1861 is going to lead to Civil War. So, sadly, one of the other results of having a slave society was it divided American society over time. And let's review. We had our first question, which was, why was slavery introduced into the colonies? And we said it was cheap land and profitable agriculture. Our second question, how did the institution of slavery influence European and African life in the colonies? First, it created a slave society in the southern colonies, and second, it was the beginning of problems between the North and the South. And how did slaves get here? What's the title of this whole thing? The Middle Passage. And I built this Lego starship right here. Good day.